Good morning. This is Nick Bravulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. And my guest this morning is Barbara Applebaum, who published a paper recently in the journal entitled Willful, Hermeneutical Ignorance and the Critical Race Theory Controversy. Barbara, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with this controversy. One of the things, sort of your starting point, is the distinction between critical race theory and what it actually is versus, I'll call it critical race theory as it gets characterized or mischaracterized in current political discourse, particularly by groups who are trying to ban what they call CRT from schools. How do you see that contrast between what critical theory, race theory is, and how it gets characterized or mischaracterized by others?
Excellent. Thank you for that question. Critical race theory is an academic theory. It's been advanced by legal scholars in the 1960s and 70s who were trying to understand why civil rights reform never led to racial justice. And they argued that the reason that racism still exists is because racism is not exclusively about individual acts of bias or hate, but that racism is systemic and embedded in institutions, in laws, in policies that claim to be race neutral, but are really driven by white norms. And that's really a very basic understanding of critical race theory, because there's so much more to that. But in the current controversy, this critical race theory has been warped from its original meaning, I would say at least in two ways. Because first of all, opponents of critical race theories in school, they say that critical race theory places too much focus on race. They believe that focusing on race is divisive. But the important thing is that they read critical race theory, quote unquote, as aiming to indoctrinate children into beliefs such as white students are oppressors, they need to feel guilty, Black students are perpetual victims. And really, I don't have time to explain how that is such a mischaracterization of what critical race theory in its origins advocates. But I call their claim that students are not allowed to disagree, maybe afraid to disagree, I call that the inability to disagree claim. And a second way that I think that is very telling about this critical race theory and those who want to ban it is that the phrase has been misappropriated as an umbrella term to cover not only difficult discussions with racism, but any form of anti-oppression education, including LGBTQIA issues. So critical race theory is being used as an umbrella term to dismiss or ban anything that challenges the status quo. That's how I would explain it.
Thank you, Barbara. So let's take one thread in what you've just said, this argument about the inability to disagree. You spend a lot of time in your paper discussing this critique. You particularly discussed the ideas of John McWhorter, I'll say maybe slightly right of center African-American linguist and social commentator on this point. So the inability to disagree argument is an interesting argument. It suggests that whites are put into a double bind by this theory. Because if, as a white person, you question it, you disagree with it, you think it's exaggerated or unfair, that itself is pointed to as evidence of one's racism and lack of sympathy for the issues. And so in that sense, the argument goes, it is impossible to disagree because the very act of disagreement is taken as confirmation of the truth of the theory. How do you see that argument playing out? How does McWhorter work with it? And what do you see as some of the limitations of that argument?
I won't go into all of those questions, because I think McWhorter is the perfect person to use to show why that argument can be very problematic. His argument is very sophisticated, and you just explained it so beautifully. He makes many arguments, and the one that I'm interested in is the one that you exactly just explained, that woke concepts such as white privilege, white fragility, even wokeness inherently preclude dissent. And he says that this kind of circular logic is tenets of a new religion, not like a religion, but a religion that's full of contradiction, lapses of logic, self-appointed proselytizers. Now, I agree. The reason I'm so attracted to this argument is because I do believe that it's very interesting to intellectually engage with. But his version of the inability to disagree claim is embedded in hyperbole about cults and religions that it's personally a red flag for me. Okay, let's put that to the side. The fundamental problem with McWhorter's version of the inability to disagree claim is that he doesn't give uptake in the sense that Christy Dotson talks about, and I explain in my essay, to the vast scholarship and debates around the very same ideas that he so scornfully and totally dismisses. Are there critiques of white privilege? Yes. Hello, I've written about that. Are there critiques of white fragility? Yes. Are there critiques of performative anti-racism? Just go to social media. And I'm just reading an article from another journal. I mean, these critiques are not marginalized or muzzled. They're seriously engaged with. So for somebody like McWhorter, whose intellectual caliber is incredible, to go to such great lengths to discredit an entire field, when instead he could have seriously and critically engaged with the scholars who similarly are critically cautious of the field. Zeus Leonardo, Cynthia Lorraine Rasky, I could name so many names. Timothy Lensmeyer, to me, is indicative of something more than just disagreement.
Yeah, fair enough. So the main thrust of your paper is to contrast that discussion and that discourse about white fragility and others with what you call the willful hermeneutical ignorance, which really is sort of the hub of your case. Say more about what you mean by this concept of willful hermeneutical ignorance.
And I'll also say why I think it's such a important concept to use to analyze the banning of critical race theory in schools.
Good.
So willful hermeneutical ignorance emphasizes how epistemic resources or concepts that explain marginalized experience with systemic injustice gets actively excluded from dominant frameworks of intelligibility by dominantly situated knowers or their supporters. So it links individuals to the maintenance of dominant epistemic systems. So when dominantly situated knowers refuse to give what we call uptake to these concepts, then cooperative interpersonal relationships between knowers become difficult, if not impossible. And I employ ideas from Christy Dotson in this essay to support this claim.
So let's talk a little bit more about, so I'm fascinated by this issue of different kinds of ignorance. I had a former doctoral student who wrote a dissertation about this. Dan DeNicola has a book out, maybe the last year or two, on the sort of the history of different views or kinds of ignorance. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of willful ignorance. Say more about that and specifically the work that willful does in that concept.
Great question. So I know there's many types of ignorance, and I'm familiar with that scholarship. Also, Jennifer Logue could be mentioned here.
That's the
I,
student I'm referring to. Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear, I thought you meant somebody else.
yeah,
So sorry.
okay.
So um, I am particularly interested in white ignorance and also how it's managed, because it's not an ignorance that's merely an absence of knowledge. It's an actively maintained ignorance. It's structural in nature, but individuals play a part in keeping it, upholding it. And there's a vested interest in not knowing. And I borrow from Jose Medina, who says that willful ignorance is not only about not knowing or even not needing to know, because, white people don't need to know a lot of stuff, but it's a needing not to know. So to go back to your question about what does willful do here? What kind of work does willful do here? Zeus Leonardo famously argues that contrary to the belief that white people are ignorant of race and racism, that white people know a lot about race and racism. What they ignore is their participation in the system. And he also brings to our attention that this emphasis on ignorance can be a way for white people to ignore responsibility. Here's where the descriptor willful becomes very significant. Willful not necessarily means intentional, although it could. Willful is more the sense of being actively maintained, and in the interest of certain social situated groups. So it's willful in the sense of this is what some dominantly social groups would want. And I think I argue in this paper that within the context of banning critical race theory in schools, directing our attention to willful ignorance, or here I'm talking specifically about willful hermeneutical ignorance, allows us to consider the harms that result from this needing not to know.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So I want to put this paper in the context of a larger body of your work on teaching about these issues, teaching about willful hermeneutical ignorance, teaching about white complicity. And one of the things I have to say I really admire about your work is that you write in a very thoughtful and reflective and even self-critical way about some of the tensions and paradoxes as a white person teaching anti-racist pedagogy. So I'm wondering if you could sort of wrap up by situating this project in the context of that larger effort of how, as a white person, you engage these issues with, again, mostly white classrooms, to actually explore these issues, not only with your students, but also explicitly engaging yourself as well.
Thank you. Can I put a plug in for my second book, White Educators? I'm asking you, and I'm still going to do it. I just published a book with Lexington, White Educators Negotiating Complicity, Roadblocks Paved with Good Intentions. And in that book, I do exactly what you just said. White educators like myself try to disrupt whiteness, and nonetheless, we continue to reinscribe it. And I'll give you an instance of my personally. For years, I've taught critical whiteness studies. And with the help of my students of color, my BIPOC students, I realized that my teaching was really still centered on the needs and the interests of white students, sacrificing the needs and interests of my BIPOC students. So I am learning to better teach critical whiteness studies from a BIPOC perspective. I really argue in the book that continuing to stay implicated in what we critique doesn't mean that people are muzzled or silenced. It rather underscores the need for vigilance. And in the book, I advocate for the cultivation of what I call a vigilantly, vulnerably informed humility. And I know that's not the solution to racism, of course. Yet I maintain that cultivating such an attitude can be a first step for white educators to collectively work with others in ways that can contribute to social justice.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Listen, so I want to encourage people to read your paper. I think it's really a fine piece of work. Thank you so much for setting aside the time to talk to me this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All the best to you.
Thank you.